Mythic Rares are pretty cool. It's the highest rarity in Magic the Gathering, and cards with it tend to be super powerful and have unique effects. Many of the best cards in Magic are printed at this rarity. Mythics also tend to be extra representative of the color they represent. Red Mythics are often big scary dragons, or cards that do a lot of direct damage to the opponent. I've recently looked at white, blue, and black Mythic Rares, and each of these top 10s was among the most stacked we've ever seen, in over 850 MTG top 10s, and today we're going to continue looking at some super powerful cards with a look at Red Mythic Rares. This list is just as insane as those were, featuring some of the most powerful red cards ever printed, and many cards that are dominating or have dominated multiple Magic formats for years on end. To be eligible for this list, a card had to be mono red, and it had to be originally printed at Mythic Rare. In all, there were 166 cards eligible, and in this video we'll look at the 10 that have left the biggest impact on competitive Magic the Gathering. This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. Use the links in the description to visit their store. Before we get started, here's a quick reminder on how I rank cards in these videos. First tier top 8s are worth 2 points, this includes events like Pro Tours, and second tier top 8s are worth 1 point. This includes events like Regional Championships. At number 10, it's Inferno Titan. You know a list is stacked when a card like the Titan is at number 10. It's part of a powerful cycle of Mythic Rare Titans that were originally printed in Core Set 2011, and it's actually the first card from that cycle to appear on one of these lists, although I'm 100% sure when we get around to looking at Green Mythic Rares, we'll see another card from this cycle. Anyway, for 4 generic and 2 red, it's a 6/6, and you can pay 1 red mana to give it +1/+0 until end of turn. While being a 6 mana 6/6 with upside is cool, what makes the Titan cycle powerful is the fact that they have an enters or attacks trigger. These are somewhat commonplace today, but these 5 Titans, including Inferno Titan, were the first creatures to ever have them. Enters or attacks triggers are powerful since they make sure you get value up front, which helps offset the problem of your creature getting removed, and if they don't remove your creature, well, you're just going to keep on generating crazy value every turn, and because of Inferno Titan's sheer size, plus the fact that it can remove creatures with a dividable lightning bolt, means that it's likely to be able to keep on attacking over and over again. Inferno Titan saw a lot of play in Standard, and it was legal there for a while as a result of being printed in 2 consecutive core sets, Magic 2011 and Magic 2012. It saw play in virtually any red deck that wasn't an aggro deck, showing up in decks like Ramp and Control. While it also saw a bit of play in Extended, it's done far more in the format that replaced it, Modern. There, it's been featured in Ramp decks like Scapeshift and Amulet Titan. While it isn't the eponymous Titan of Amulet Titan decks, that would be Primeval Titan, it is still a very good creature to ramp into, and the deck can often give it haste with handwire battlements, and getting the enters and attacks trigger in the same turn is pretty backbreaking. It's also found success in modern Ponza decks, which are both ramp and land destruction decks, and one of the best ways to leverage that mana advantage is to slam the Titan on the battlefield early and wipe away anything your opponent has managed to cast with the mana they do have. For a time, it was also cheated into play in Legacy Sneak Attack decks, which could use that powerful enchantment to put the Titan into play with haste for a turn, once again getting its powerful trigger twice in a single turn. Inferno Titan also used to be one of the main win condition in vintage Oath of Druids decks, to the point that between 2016 and 2019, there was a variant of the deck simply called Inferno Oath. The Titan was a great creature to put into play on turn 2, since it typically wiped the opponent's board while also pressuring your opponent in a big way. It can also go after the opponent and kill them super quickly, usually in just 2 swings between its body, fire breathing, and its trigger. Unfortunately, the power level of non-rotating formats has passed the Titan by, as it doesn't have any top 8 since 2022. There are just way better creatures to cheat into play these days. If you're looking for one that lets you interact with your opponent while adding a big body to the board, you can just go with Archon of Cruelty, which has flying and has an enters or attacks trigger of its own that is generally more powerful, since it drains 3 life, makes the opponent give up a card in hand or something on the battlefield, and draws you a card. So Inferno Titan is unlikely to be on this list for very much longer, with Past in Flames active and only a few points behind it. At number 9, it's Indomitable Creativity. For X and 3 red mana, it destroys X target artifacts and or creatures, and for each permanent destroyed this way, its controller reveals cards from the top of their library until an artifact or creature is revealed and exiles it, and then those players put the exiled cards onto the battlefield and shuffle. Creativity is one of the best ways to cheat scary creatures into play early. To pull that off, you just build a deck that doesn't have any artifacts or creatures in it other than some insane monster, like Atraxa. But you have to target creatures or artifacts with creativity in the first place, right? How are you supposed to do that if you aren't running any other creatures or artifacts? Well, you can get creatures or artifacts into play without actually playing any cards with those types by playing cards that make tokens, like Fable of the Mirror Breaker, and then you can target those tokens with creativity. And if your deck is built correctly, you always get your Atraxa super early in the game, which is tough to beat. There weren't any good ways to abuse creativity in Standard, but creativity decks have been thriving in formats with larger card pools that have many more great creatures to cheat into play, and efficient ways to make tokens, like Pioneer and Modern, where creativity decks have been highly successful since 2020, and it doesn't really look like that's going to change anytime soon, so it's likely we see creativity climb higher on this list in the future. At number 8, it's Embercleave. For 4 generic and 2 red, it's got flash, costs 1 generic less mana to cast for each attacking creature you control, attaches to target creature for free when it enters, and it gives +1/+1 double strike and trample. It has an equip cost of 3 generic. This equipment is a mono-red player's dream. In a super aggressive deck, you can play this for a whole lot less than 6 mana most of the time, and you get a free equip right away. Casting this at instant speed tends to allow your creature to win whatever combat it was part of, while smashing in for tons of damage. Or if your creature is just completely unblocked, it can result in lethal damage out of nowhere. This led to Embercleave seeing lots of play in aggro decks, especially in Standard and Pioneer. However, its last significant top 8 came in early 2024, and these days Red aggro decks and Pioneer aren't using it, instead opting to build their own Embercleave much earlier in the game by going crazy with much cheaper tricks, like Monstrous Rage and creatures who pay you off for being targeted, like Heartfire Hero, and then you can use something like Manifold Mouse to grant the double strike. These decks are even faster than Embercleave decks were, so like Inferno Titan, Embercleave isn't likely to be on this list for very much longer. At number 7, it's Hazoret the Fervent. For 3 generic and a red, it's an indestructible 5/4 with haste, but it can't attack or block unless you have 1 or fewer cards in hand. You can also pay 2 generic and a red and discard a card to have it deal 2 damage to each opponent. So Hazoret can help you meet its requirement by letting you turn cards in hand into damage, and then it can smash in for a big hit itself. Hazoret has seen multi-format success, and it's usually played in aggro decks, which often have an empty hand by the time they play their 4-drop anyway. The whole package makes for a very aggressive creature that can smash in for hasty, difficult to block damage, and can finish the opponent off with its ability. Hazoret was heavily played in standard red-based aggro decks, and was one of the defining cards in the format while it was there. It's also seen play in other formats, although the only other format where it's been really consistent is Pioneer, where it's been played in lots of different red decks since the format was created. Right now it's being played in the Red Mice aggro decks I mentioned a moment ago, as well as in Red Deck Wins. It's seen occasional play in modern decks focused on discard like Hollow One, and most of its success and legacy has come in mono-red prison decks that aim to lock the game down with things like Chalice of the Void and Ensnaring Bridge, and Hazoret provides the deck a win condition with its direct damage ability, while also assuring that your hand stays empty. Hazoret is likely to keep gaining points going forward, especially in Pioneer, so its place on this list is probably secure in the future. At number 6, it's Seasoned Pyromancer. For 1 generic and 2 red, it's a 2/2, and when it enters you discard 2 cards and then draw 2 cards, and for each non-land card discarded this way, you get a 1/1 elemental token. You can also pay 3 generic and 2 red and exile the Pyromancer from the graveyard to get 2 1/1 elemental tokens. This card's great because it adds a bunch of bodies to the board while also digging you deeper in your library, and it's especially nasty when you discard non-lands that you wanted to put in the graveyard anyway. This is just such a great value card, and that's led to it seeing tons of play. However, it's from Modern Horizons, so the only 60-card formats it's legal in are Modern, Legacy, and Vintage, so its success has been limited to those formats, and it's found success in all of them, and especially Modern, where it's been regularly played ever since being printed. It's not that far from being a staple in the format, but it gets especially good in any deck that can take extra advantage of the discard, like by discarding something that you can cast from the graveyard like Firebolt or Flage, or simply by using the cards you discard to help you delve Murktide Regent. The Pyromancer is going to rack up lots of points in Modern going forward, and it's likely to stay on this list in the future. At number 5, it's Arclight Phoenix. For 3 generic and a red, it's a 3/2 with flying and haste, and at the beginning of combat on your turn, if you've cast 3 or more instant and sorcery spells this turn, you return the Phoenix from your graveyard to the battlefield. A 4-mana 3/2 with haste and flying is not very good, but you know what is? A 0-mana 3/2 with flying and haste, and that's what this amounts to being in the decks that play it. Sure, you have to cast spells, but those spells are giving you whatever their effects are, in addition to ultimately bringing back at least one Phoenix. The Phoenix has been strong enough to power eponymous decks in Standard, Pioneer, Modern, and Legacy, and it's been especially successful in Pioneer and Modern. Generally, it sees play alongside other creatures who love cheap spells and let you put the Phoenixes in the graveyard, like Ledger Shredder and Dragon's Rage Channeler. These decks can do tons of damage in a hurry thanks to the presence of lots of good, cheap spells. Arclight Phoenix is going to continue to find success in Pioneer and Modern. At number 4, it's Ragavan, Nimble, Pilferer. For 1 red mana, it's a 2/1, and when it hits an opponent, you make a treasure token and exile the top card of that player's library, and until end of turn, you can cast that card. It also comes with Dash, which means you can pay the alternate cost of 1 generic and a red to cast him with haste, and he returns to your hand at the beginning of the next end step. In other words, Ragavan is a nicely statted 1-drop that is also an insane value engine since it gives you mana and cards. It makes it so red decks have a very hard time running out of gas, even when they're very aggressive. It's from Modern Horizons 2, so it's never been legal in Standard or Pioneer, but it quickly asserted itself as perhaps the best 1-drop in Modern, Legacy, and Vintage, and it asserted itself so effectively in Legacy that it had to be banned there. Its hold on Modern and Vintage isn't loosening either, so it's going to continue to put up top 8s. Of course, the same is true of the cards in front of it, so this might be the best Ragavan can do. At number 3, it's Shatterskull Smashing. For X and 2 red mana, it's a sorcery that does X damage divided as you choose among up to 2 target creatures and planeswalkers. And if X is 6 or more, it does twice X damage divided as you choose instead. So as a sorcery, it's not the most efficient thing ever, especially if you're paying less than 6 for X, even if you can divide the damage between a couple of things. However, this is a modal double-faced card. That means you can also choose to play this card as its other side, which is Shatterskull the Hammer Pass, a land that can tap for red that enters tapped unless you pay 3 life. We've seen cards from this cycle show up in every video on Mythic Rares so far, and all of them have been played in every single format they are legal in, and that tells you a lot about how powerful modal double-faced cards are, especially when they're a land on one side and a spell on the other. And in this case, the land can even enter untapped. Basically, if you draw this while you're flooding out, you're going to be pretty happy because you can cast it as Shatterskull Smashing, and if you draw it when you need a land, well, you'll play it as a land. This means it's good whether you're flooding or mana screwed, and there aren't very many cards in Magic that that's true about. It saw significant play in Standard, showing up in virtually any red deck. Perhaps the most interesting deck it was part of was Jeskai Hinata, because with Hinata in play, Shatterskull Smashing becomes far more efficient since you can reduce the cost for each target. In Pioneer, it tends to see play in aggressive red decks, as they like to play as few lands as possible and keep drawing gas, and this gives them a land that can do something when you need it to. Like the other Mythic Rare modal double-faced lands, this has also been played in decks that take advantage of the rules about this type of land. Because the front face of the card isn't a land, that means that cards that check for lands while revealing cards in your library, like Goblin Charbelcher or Balustrade Spy, don't see them as lands. This means that if your deck's lands are all modal double-faced lands like this one, the Belcher will always do lethal when you activate it, and the Spy will always mill your entire library, enabling a combo that will win you the game. The Balustrade Spy combo got both it and the similar Undercity Informer banned in Pioneer, but the combo is still intact in other formats like Modern and Legacy, and it sees play in plenty of other decks in both of those formats too. One other major benefit of playing Shatterskull Smashing is that it's a land when that's what you need, but it can also be pitched to cards that ask specifically for red cards, like Fury, something most lands can't do. Shatterskull Smashing is going to continue to put up top 8s going forward. Now that I've told you about Shatterskull Smashing, I want to ask you to smash that subscribe button. I put out multiple Magic videos every single week, so you won't regret it. I'm hoping to hit 100,000 subscribers this year, and I'd really appreciate your help getting there. At number 2, it's Fury, which I just mentioned when looking at Shatterskull Smashing. As with the Zendikar Rising Mythic Rare modal double-face land cycle, every Mythic Rare incarnation from Modern Horizons 2 has also made their colors Mythic Rare top 10, and that's not surprising because they're all super powerful. For For 3 generic and 2 red, it's a 3/3 with double strike, and when it enters, it deals 4 damage divided as you choose among any number of target creatures or planeswalkers. That's already a pretty sweet card. It removes stuff and adds a big double strike body to the board fairly efficiently, but it's the last part of the card that really pushes it into absurd territory. Like all of the elemental incarnations from Modern Horizons 2, it has an evoke that doesn't cost any mana. In this case, you exile a red card from your hand, like Shatterskull Smashing. That's an alternate casting cost, but if you cast it that way, you sacrifice it right away. In other words, you only get the enters trigger, at least in theory. Even if that is what happens, you're usually going to be pretty happy to cast a removal spell for free, and because the damage is dividable, you can even end up breaking even on cards instead of 2-for-1ing yourself. It's another Modern Horizons card, so it isn't legal everywhere, but where it has been legal, it's been an absolute beating. Nowhere has this been more true than in Modern, where it was played alongside fellow elemental incarnation Grief in Rakdos scam decks. This deck gets its name because of the fact that its defining elements feel like they just aren't fair. The game plan in those decks is to evoke one of the incarnations and then cast a recursive instant like Not Dead After All. This brings back the sacrificed elemental, and you get the enters trigger all over again. And the creature's even bigger than it was originally. In other words, with Fury, you spend 0 mana for a 4/4 with double strike that does 8 dividable damage to your opponent's board. Yeah, sounds like a scam, right? Ultimately, Wizards of the Coast agreed, and Fury got banned out of the format because of how nasty this was. That means these days, Fury is only legal in Legacy and Vintage when it comes to 60-card formats, but it probably doesn't surprise you that it sees plenty of play in those formats too. It's very heavily played in Legacy, showing up in a wide variety of decks, including aggro decks like Goblins, combo decks like Painter, tempo decks like Cascade Crash, and prison decks like Dragon Stompy. Almost everyone who is playing Red in the format has at least a couple copies of Fury somewhere in their 75. It sees play in Vintage too, though it's more limited there to decks that run very little mana, like Bazaar aggro decks, which look to just discard everything they have with Bazaar of Baghdad and cast a bunch of free creatures or return them from the graveyard. These decks don't typically run very many mana-producing lands, if they run any at all, but they do still need removal, and Fury does the job because it can cast it for free. Despite being banned in Modern, Fury is still racking up lots of points, especially in Legacy, so it's going to continue to be very high in this list in the future, but it's got a ways to go if it ever wants to catch the #1 card on the list, which is Chandra, Torch of Defiance. We've seen some impressive cards on this list, but Chandra blows them completely out of the water, or I guess burns them out of the fire, with her massive score of 255. Anyway, she's 2 generic and 2 red mana, and she starts with 4 loyalty, and she comes with 4 loyalty abilities, which always makes Planeswalkers extra strong. More modes are always better, and Chandra's abilities are all pretty sweet. Her first +1 exiles a top card of your library and you can cast that card, but if you don't, she does 2 to your opponent. Her other +1 ramps your mana, her -3 does 4 to a creature, and her -7 gives you an emblem with, whenever you cast a spell, this emblem deals 5 damage to any target. Basically, she can remove creatures, ramp your mana, or draw you cards, and if you get to her ultimate, your opponent will not be long for this world. She was a staple in red decks and standard, allowing her to accumulate a ridiculous 154 points in that format alone, but she's gone on to see significant play in Magic's other formats too, like Pioneer, Historic, Modern, Legacy, and Vintage, and she shows up in all sorts of decks in those formats ranging from Burn to Prison decks to Control. In the long run, it's very possible Shatterskull Smashing or Fury catch Chandra. A lot of her massive score is a result of being one of the most heavily played cards in Standard, and while it's still putting up top 8s in Pioneer, Modern, and Legacy, it's only getting a few top 8s each month, whereas Shatterskull Smashing and Fury are seeing more play right now. Still, the lead is massive, and she is still active, so she's going to remain #1 on this list for quite a while, at the very least. So, those are the best Red Mythic Rares in Magic. If you want to own any of these super powerful red cards, check out the description, where you can find a direct Card Kingdom link for each card that appeared in the video. If you want to make sure you catch future videos, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. And if you want to catch up on past videos, including more that look at the best Mythic Rares in the game, you should see a playlist on your screen shortly. Thanks for watching.